It's a real privilege to be taking part in this exciting meeting. This is really the first chance that I and Stephen, I think, have had to present this book in a wider format and to discuss some of the issues arising. So I'm really interested, and certainly I expect criticisms. I'm keen for feedback of any kind. So please don't feel that because the editors are here that you have to be nice. So I'm going to share my screen and just give a brief introduction to the origins of the book. Yeah, so I was just, this is my natural environment in a neonatal intensive care unit with tiny little babies and sophisticated technology. And so as I became more and more interested in the ethical issues raised, I realized that as technology advances, it raises fundamental questions about anthropology. And each advance in biomedical technology raises questions about what it means to be human. And I've always been interested in artificial intelligence, interested in science fiction and so on. And I increasingly became convinced that this was the next big challenge to human anthropology. And so I'm extremely grateful to the Faraday Institute. I see Dennis Alexander in the audience and want to pay tribute to him for his encouragement and support in managing to get this project off the ground as part of a larger project based at the Faraday Institute. And the idea was to have a number of conferences and multidisciplinary workshops in order to engage in the conversation about how advances in AI were changing our understanding of what it meant to be human. I was a co-investigator PI with Peter Robinson, who's professor of computing and who at Cambridge University, and who also wrote a chapter in the book. And this led on ultimately to our book, and I was very keen not to produce just a standard book that cost £150 and which sat on a bookshelf raining dust because no one ever read it. And the model that I felt to try to emulate was actually John Stott's book, Issues Facing Christians Today, which I've always felt is a kind of model of engaging topics at a level which is accessible for a general audience and which doesn't shy away from serious theological thinking. And I'm very grateful for SBCK, who were prepared to support this, and also to Stephen Williams, who came alongside as co-editor. He was part of the project as well. And I've come to the conclusion that editing a multi-author book is an experience you should only have once in a lifetime. And I've now had that experience. It's been a great experience. I've really enjoyed working with Stephen, but frankly, I'm not that keen to do it again because it's also been remarkably challenging. Anyway, we're very grateful that this volume is now out and it is generally available. And it is available in the States and as well as in continental Europe, although accessibility is still, I think, we're slowly trying to make it more available to general audiences. So my interest in technology in part is that in the history of human thinking, you can see how advanced the most advanced technology of the time has always been used as a way of understanding what it means to be human. And so we've had precision clocks, we've had steam engines, we've had switchboards, and most recently we've got supercomputers. And just as one example of the sort of popular discourse, Daniel Dennett saying we are not just robots, we're robots made of robots made of robots. In this digital age of supercomputers and smartphones, surely it isn't difficult to imagine how a machine made up of a trillion moving parts might just be capable of being human. And so, as has often been said, we humanize machines and we mechanize ourselves. And I think that process, or those processes, are very definitely continuing at present. And so we tend to, in popular culture, prioritize intelligence versus embodiment. And I think there is, of course, a great deal behind the idea that human beings are machine-like. That's a valuable metaphor. And certainly my own clinical work as a clinician, I've often used machine metaphors of ways of understanding how to provide intensive care. But I think it's critically important to recognize the difference between a useful metaphor and a fundamental description, or an ontological definition. And I think it's confusion between the metaphor and the ontology, which lies at the heart of much of secular confusion. There are many aspects of the human brain which are machine-like, but it's both false and incoherent to say that the brain is a machine. So I think for those who are interested in theology, it's obvious that questions of ontology, we're naturally drawn to ontology. So trying to understand the ontology of what it means to be human and the ontology of what it means to be a machine. And I think that's entirely proper and appropriate. And certainly some of the material in the book is wrestling with those fundamental ontological questions. But I'm also convinced that the epistemological questions are just as important and just as troubling as the ontological questions. And what do I mean by that? Well, I was at a conference several years ago with a whole bunch of senior church leaders, including Episcopal, bishops and the rest. And we were discussing technology and artificial intelligence and robotics and how, as Christians, we should respond. And as part of the conference, we visited a computer lab in the local university. And so this bunch of dignitaries, male and female, enter into the computer lab. And on the floor of the computer lab are 5 of these little robots. They're called Nio robots. They were all switched on. Their eyes were blinking. Their arms were moving. And they were talking. And instantaneously, the atmosphere in the room changes. And a diocesan bishop, no less, gets down on his hands and knees and says, "Oh, the little darling, hello, how are you?" And people are waving and smiling and taking selfies. And I'm watching this and thinking, if this is how church leaders respond to robots, what hope is there for the rest of the community? But also, as I was reflecting on that, I thought that most of these people and these leaders had been parents. They themselves had cared for small toddlers, and they were responding to this robot in the way that any human being would respond to a small child who you found wandering around the floor. So these questions of anthropomorphism, this is a bizarre story of people creating apps of their dead friends and talking to them, sending text and receiving back text via the artificial AI within the app. This kind of anthropomorphism is something that we're naturally drawn to, and which we're often is not under conscious control. And science fiction, I think, plays a very important part in developing consciousness about machines and so on. And the American television series Westworld is set in a place where a fantasy land set out in a desert where there are human-like robots and where genuine humans can go and live in this fantasy land and basically do whatever they like. And in one of the early scenes in the series, a human being arrives for the first time in this robot theme park, and this beautiful woman comes up to him and basically asks him if there's anything that she can do for him. And he stares at her and says, "Are you one of them or are you real?" And she says, "If you can't tell, does it matter?" Now, I think that is a fundamental question, an epistemological question. If you can't tell whether a being is conscious or not, whether this machine is conscious or not, if you can't tell whether it's a real person or not, then how do we respond to that from Christian theology? Now, we're not at that stage yet, but it's coming. As the technology increases, it becomes more and more sophisticated. And so I our aim in writing this book was really to stimulate the conversation. In no sense do we think that this is any kind of definitive statement on how a Christian faith engages with artificial intelligence. It's very much an exercise in double listening, which is what I learned from start about trying to listen to the culture and listen to what's going on, and at the same time listen to the unchanging Christian faith and have a conversation there. I think the book can be criticized in that we focus less on the very obvious benefits of AI in many different fields and much more on potential challenges and problems. But I hope it will act as a stimulus and as a catalyst. I think much further work, theological work and cultural analysis is required. And then to close, I'm fascinated by, in the history of Christian theology, it's often been the advent of new external challenges to orthodox beliefs that has led to new creative theological developments. If it wasn't for Arius, we wouldn't have the doctrine of the Trinity. So my belief is that the new challenges of AI and robotics to orthodox theological anthropology may lead to creative development and of an understanding of what it means to be human. Thanks very much.
Thank you very much, John, for that very stimulating introduction. And now we'll hand over to the other editor, Stephen Williams.
Well, thank you, Craig. Let me join John in thanking you for this opportunity. It's great that you're hosting it, and marvelous to have the chance of critical feedback from a number of people. And let me thank John Wyatt too. John, it was you who pulled me into this. And I was then and am now the most unlikely candidate for getting involved in this, because I am embarrassingly poor at anything technological. And people have laughed when they've heard I got involved in this at all. And I had to emphasize to them that I was really thinking about the theological issues involved and philosophical issues involved. But it means that I'm permanently insecure in this area, because I'm afraid that everybody will know something basic about technology and AI, which I don't know about, and that I will show my ignorance. But I love to live dangerously, and there it is. Now, I want to say four things, and I'm not going to be tight or systematic in what I say. I simply want to make four remarks or four sets of observations here. Firstly, if I were reviewing this volume, I would be critical of it, perhaps on more than one ground. But I do regret that we didn't have a chapter on military technology. I'll speak for myself here, though John may share a great deal of what I say. There's a backstory to that. But the point was made in the introduction. Some of you may have noticed it if you read the introduction, that the question of military technology, we do deal with, or different authors deal with, laws, lethal autonomous weapon systems, but they deal with it in the course of talking about something else. So there's no chapter on the military, on laws. And we say that this raises independent questions of the morality of warfare. Now, that's true, but it's insufficient. It's true in that those of us who are either pacifist or nuclear pacifist or inclined to pacifism, those of us who are in that position will think that the developments in lethal autonomous systems, while they introduce novel issues very clearly, don't affect the fundamental moral issues concerning warfare. But that really wasn't an adequate reason for omitting a chapter on it, because along with, well, after gunpowder and nuclear arms, the development of lethal autonomous weapon systems has been regarded as a third big development, a third revolution in warfare. So there is a backstory to why there wasn't something on that. And I certainly regret it. Maybe John feel the same. Let me just make that as a first observation. Second observation I want to make is about surveillance capitalism. I suppose at one stage, if people have been asked what application of artificial intelligence socially and culturally is most troubling, people would have talked, apart from military, would have talked about the question of employment or work more widely. Will robots take our jobs? Now, it seems to me that although that is still at the forefront of people's thinking, certainly as a result of COVID, the question of surveillance has come to at least equal that as a concern in public life and public thought. We could have gone further than we did had we had more space in the chapter on surveillance capitalism, because issues arise in relation to data. For example, who owns data? And there are different schools of thought, as some of you may know. The dignitarian or the proprietarian. Dignitarian school of thought, to put it broadly like that, holds that the possession of our data by big tech companies is something which upsets human dignity, and that is the affront. That's a moral issue involved. Others take the line that it's a matter of property rights. You know, your data, what you put out there, and the likes you express and so forth, those are your property. That's your property. In fact, you can link that up to theories of labor. You've labored to produce this stuff. So there are different views of the significance of ethical issues in relation to data. And there are issues also in relation to surveillance capitalism, which maybe suggest clear conceptual distinctions, but it's not clear what the force of the distinction is. So, for example, Zuboff, of whose work we make much, Emeritus Professor in Harvard Business School, the author of this superb work on the age of surveillance capitalism, Zuboff has been criticized for talking about the invasion of the privacy of individuals. But it's been argued that what actually happens is not that there's interest on the part of advertisers and high-tech companies and individuals, but they're interested in you as the representative of a type. You as the representative of type. Now, conceptually, the distinction between interested in an individual and interested in someone as the individual representative of a type, conceptually clear. What is the force of that? Ethically, what is the difference? And that's something we could have explored. But the application of that seems to be a very important one, and we closed our book with a chapter on that. Thirdly, in the course of that chapter, Nathan Mladin, whose knowledge of surveillance capitalism and the surrounding issues and data is greater than mine, he was my co-author. In that chapter, he and I refer to the fact that we suspect that the quest for artificial general intelligence, sometimes known as human level intelligence, that is a bit of a red herring. So if it's a bit of a red herring, why pursue it at all? Now, in the AI community, if I can call it a single community for a moment, there are different views on artificial general intelligence. No one involved in it says it's coming anytime soon, although it depends what you mean by soon. Admittedly, some think we might be a few years or 10, 15 years away from it, but most people think it's much, much longer than that, and some people say we're never going to get there anyway. So if artificial general intelligence, human level intelligence, is not on the horizon yet, and may be an impossibility, if that is the case, why give it any time at all? I think the reason is this, that those who talk about AGI, or ASI, artificial superintelligence for that matter, are revealing ways of thinking about human nature and about the human person, which are important for us to grapple with. So my concern is not only with what may happen, important as it is, but with the ways in which we are thinking about what it is to be a person. And it struck me, reading the material, that so often you hear that the paradigm of human intelligence is chess playing. The really intelligent person is the great chess player. I ask myself, why should that be the paradigm of human intelligence rather than the mother or father who's trying to work out how to cajole a 3-year-old to do something or other? Why do we regard the capacity to win at chess to be the epitome of intelligence rather than my capacity to emotionally manage a 2 or 3-year-old? In terms of world and society, the latter is far, far more important. And yet, chess has been the paradigm. Now, things have developed since early AI, since those chess games, so that in the recent history of AI, well, AI really only got going as a field in the 1950s. Since then, there has developed what is sometimes called deep learning, interest in neural networks. Neuroscience has been brought into it, sub-symbolic AI. So the AI is not all about mathematics and logic. It has to do with the attempt to see how it is that we can construct machines that learn on the basis of our learning from neural networks we have. So things have moved on since the early days when there's an emphasis on the symbolic and the algebraic and the logical. Nevertheless, there are ways of thinking about intelligence which are still there. You know, intelligence is rationality, and not just rationality, it's rationality of a certain kind. I find myself wanting to think in the context of this debate about what people value in the human person. It's as though sometimes emotional intelligence is something grafted onto it in people's understanding. You know, let's also ask about emotional intelligence, whereas as a matter of fact, emotion is prior to reason. In the baby, well, you know, John is the expert in this, not I, but in the baby feels long before it can articulate, and that is the substrate of reasoning. In AI, things seem to have been backwards there. And in this context, I'll be quick here. I think I've been about 9 minutes or so I've got 4 or 5, I think. In this context, I've gone back to Descartes. Descartes is, I think, a fascinating figure for more than one reason. But I'm going to confine myself to the one reason I find him fascinating for our purposes. When Descartes wrote his Discourse of Method, published it, and it's been regarded by many as the founding document of modern philosophy, Descartes talks about the way in which he was searching for truth. It's an individual search for truth because Descartes was a loner, emotionally deprived in infancy, lost his mother when he's very small, largely absent father. There was a nanny or nurse who gave him some emotional comfort and sustenance, but he was a loner. He found his Jesuit education unsatisfactory philosophically and theologically. So he goes it alone in the search for truth, taking advantage of the scientific knowledge which people like Galileo had generated. So Descartes comes up with a method for philosophy which consists in doubting everything you can doubt. It's well known, of course. But what Descartes says is this. He says, all right, when anyone is building a house, they have to live somewhere. Now, here I am thinking about philosophy and science and truth as an individual. So what am I to do? Well, how am I to live while thinking about that? He gives 4 rules for living, but the first rule is this: to follow the religion and customs of my country. Now, he was a Catholic. Had Descartes followed Christian faith, as Christian faith should be, he would have built in at ground level into his thinking that the human individual is relational, that the relationships of love are fundamental. He didn't. He could then have gone on to say, look, philosophically, I'm going to examine whether love is fundamental, and that might show it's not fundamental. He might have been able to say that, but in the interim, the house he wanted to live in, if he was following religions and customs of his country, if his country had followed good Christian religion, as it were, Descartes would have said, I know that the basic stuff of human life is love and interrelationship. Instead of which, his is a solitary quest for truth, and conforming to religion and customs of his country while he pursues that solitary quest does not mean for Descartes getting involved in relationships. Fourthly and finally, I'll be very quick here. Theologically, what challenges arise? Many, but I'm going to make two quick remarks in relation to this. One is, speaking personally, I found increasingly that I want to distinguish between what, as a theologian or Christian, I can say, and what, as a philosopher or scientist, I can say. So if you ask me, Stephen Williams, as a theologian, are you a physicalist in relation to the mind-brain question, or are you a dualist, or are you somewhere in between that? My answer is, you tell me. I can't tell you, because let me tell you what I believe as a Christian. These are things I believe. Now, you tell me whether physicalism fits that, or dualism fits that, or what fits it in between. You as a philosopher tell me, you as a scientist tell me. As a Christian philosopher and Christian scientist, you must instruct me in the Christian faith, but as a theologian, I can't be immediately committed to physicalism or to dualism unless there is some manifest sort of evidence of that biblically or traditionally, or in terms of systematic theological thought. It doesn't matter if that's a good example or not. My point is that I certainly want to demarcate between what Christians must believe as Christians and what a Christian philosophy or Christian science will say. And the second thing, as a theologian, I've been struck with, and here I end, is the significance of the church. When I read people writing about AI, they almost always say, big analysts like Zuboff, Sherry Turkle, MIT, and other smaller fish, they'll say, well, let's have a conversation about this, or let's be the friction, let's do something that makes us resist these things. But people don't seem to have a clue really what to do about many of these things. God has called the church, the poor, the feeble, to be his witnesses, so that his words spoken in his time, his deeds done in his time by this poor people, those are going to be the things that are going to change things. Strategies are good, let's think, but as a matter of fact, humble, faithful obedience in the life of the church, that is going to be what is going to really address, I think, some of these questions. Theologically, I've been struck more and more with that. Craig, my friend, I hope I haven't gone over my time, but if I have, my apologies. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Stephen. That was wonderfully rich. And so you and John have, I think, set the table for a really, really good discussion. And we're very grateful for that. And now my friend Derek Schuurman from Calvin University is going to be our first respondent.
Thanks, Craig, and to the KLC for organizing this event and for the privilege of inviting me to join in a conversation around this wonderful book. I'm grateful to John Wyatt and Stephen Williams for the wonderful contribution that they've made to the ongoing dialogue surrounding AI and robotics. It's encouraging to see Christians thoughtfully engage these important and timely topics. I'm also delighted that this book drew insights from many different disciplines: theology, philosophy, social sciences, medicine, literature, film studies, fine arts, journalism, and so on. I strongly believe that the issues which arise in the areas of AI and robotics require interdisciplinary thinking because it intersects an array of social, cultural, economic, philosophical, theological aspects of reality. There have been a flurry of books about AI by individual pundits and philosophers, but very, very few that draw on different ways of knowing from a wide variety of disciplines, as this book does. In particular, I was delighted to see a computer scientist included in the list of contributors. Frankly, it's perplexing when books on AI are written by philosophers alone who wax eloquently but exclude the voices of the very people creating the tools in question. Or when they do include a voice, it's from a computer scientist like Ray Kurzweil, who are on the philosophical fringes of the discipline. Indeed, we must engage engineers and computer scientists, since they're the ones creating these tools and are the ones in a position to influence change. Perhaps as a computer scientist, I'm being a little bit too sensitive about the representation of my discipline, but I noted that the contribution by the computer scientist was the shortest contribution in this book, having the conspicuous distinction of not having a chapter number of its own. But nevertheless, it warmed my heart to see a computer scientist like Peter Robinson included in the list of authors, and I tip my hat to Wyatt and Williams for including his voice. The subtitle of the book is Artificial Intelligence and the Christian Faith, but my first impression as I read the opening chapters was that there was a lot to say about AI, but not much about the Christian faith. However, I quickly realized that these initial chapters were grouped in part one of the book under the heading, What's Going On?, the main purpose of which was to introduce a cultural and historical analysis, which they do well. Later, in parts 2 and 3 of the book, the authors bring in rich insights from the Christian faith to inform a wide variety of issues. For example, Chapter 10 unabashedly explores developments in sex tech, sexual technology, and applies a Christian perspective to the body on this topic, rightly making the case that sex tech crosses significant boundaries in the cultural and theological meanings of intimacy. Another example of wise Christian thinking was in Chapter 7, titled Robots, AI, and Human Uniqueness, Learning What Not to Fear by Robert Song. This was my favorite chapter. I underlined more text in this chapter than any other place in the book. I found this chapter to be extremely thoughtful in explicitly connecting AI with the presuppositions of the Christian faith by connecting a Christian understanding of what it means to be human. I've written on similar ideas myself, but not so eloquently as Song does in this chapter. So bravo. I strongly agree with Song's claim that we should not tie the distinct status of humankind to some unique human capability. Anything we point to will risk being undermined by the rising tide of AI capabilities, as he writes, which have already broken barriers by enabling machines to speak, compose songs, write poems, and play the game of Go, and so on. To quote Robert Song, in truth, theology should not be beholden to this kind of contingency. The reasonableness of the Christian faith should not go up and down like the stock market based on how intelligent, creative, caring, or lethal AI turns out to be, end quote. Song makes the important point about how certain presuppositions in AI can undermine our notions about what it means to be human. The very idea that we are merely machines poses a genuine threat to human dignity and worth, as he points out. Song writes that, quote, even if robots were to gain something like human levels of intelligence and the other capacities we identify with being human, this would still not, as such, be a threat for humans, who are made according to their kind. Our ontological status and vocation remain secure, regardless of the advances in AI. This point reminds me of a passage from Craig Bartholomew's book, The Contours of the Kuyperian Tradition, where he writes, quote, we should start with ontology. This is our Father's world, and we are creatures made in his image, and then move to epistemology. As his creatures, how do we go about knowing this world truly, end quote. I believe it is these ontological questions that will help us discern appropriate roles for both humans and machines. We are often captivated by what things can do rather than asking what things are. Once we have established the ontological question of who we are and what machines are, we can then start asking questions about the best way to move forward, including questions about the appropriate use of AI. For this reason, I think AI will require the service of good Christian philosophy, namely a good Christian ontology, epistemology, anthropology, and ethics, and not just theology, as we discern a path forward. Now that I've made the case about why I admire this book, allow me to offer a few minor critiques, which I offer in the spirit of iron sharpening iron. So while this book engages a wide variety of topics, lethal autonomous weapons, sex tech, robots, the future of work, healthcare, and so on. And because of the breadth of the multiplicity of authors, it reads like an edited volume, which is in fact what it is. But I wonder if the book may have benefited from including a common theme or touchstone for each chapter. Indeed, the book's conclusion observes that anthropology and what it means to be human is, quote, a theme that emerges in different forms in virtually every chapter in this volume, end quote. I suspect having each chapter explicitly engage this theme could have resulted in a little bit more coherence for the overall volume. Another small critique, there were a few places where important topics were brought up, but were only dealt with very thinly. And one of the editors addressed this already. For example, 2 chapters bring up the topic of lethal autonomous weapon systems, but breeze through the topic in only 1 page or so, offering mostly observations and summaries and more questions. Certainly, there are compelling Christian resources, such as the long tradition of just war theory, where we could say something more direct and substantial about lethal autonomous weapons, understanding that not all Christians would agree on this. Even so, I understand that there are practical limits to the lengths of each chapter and the depth to which each issue can be addressed. A final note, I'm always looking for practical insights that can help Christian engineers and computer scientists, resources which answer the question, how then shall we engineer? And in this case, how to build robots and AI applications in a responsible way. Granted, this was not the primary goal of the book, but if we were to move forward from insights to plausible action, we will need to distill practical guidelines for those designing robots and AI on the front lines. Indeed, there are very few Christian books that provide practical guidance for engineers and computer scientists. I suspect it's because that is a tall order. Christian engineering leaves a good deal to the responsible imagination of the human being who is called to shape our digital world. Nevertheless, I suspect that many of the ideas in this book could be fruitfully mined to develop further practical insights. And if I could offer one more critique, we need not only a discussion about what not to do with AI, but also to explore normative uses that we ought to pursue with AI. You know, applications to show love to neighbor and care for the earth and its creatures. You know, this book could have done a little bit more to just talk about responsible, beneficial, normative applications of AI and what that might look like. I applaud the idea raised by the editors in the conclusion as well, that Christians ought to find common cause with others who celebrate the centrality of physical embodiment to our human way of being in the world. As an aside, I'm part of a group called AI and Faith, which is an interfaith group, an ecumenical interfaith group discussing AI and looking at bringing together people from a wide variety of different religious traditions to explore that. And so finding common cause with those and others, I think is essential. As Christians, we can't afford to work alone. We need to pursue principled pluralism to engage the larger public square and influence the corporations and government regulations that dictate how our tools are shaped, bringing 2,000 years of Christian social thought to bear. We need more Daniels in Babylon. In conclusion, I liked how the ending paragraphs of the book speculate about the place of robots and AI in the new heavens and earth. In a capstone computer science course I teach here at Calvin University, I pose a similar question to my students. Do you think there'll be computers in heaven, in the new heavens and earth? Many of my students remain highly skeptical, but I speculate there will be computers. I believe the new heavens and the new earth will be a continuity of creation, full of all the creational possibilities like computers and AI and robots too, but of course in a manner that will be free from sin. And whatever that turns out to look like, we need to strive to build some imperfect models of the perfect world to come. So borrowing the closing words of the book, quote, may we pray for the wisdom to discriminate right from wrong on this earth and for the strength to act in accordance with what we discern. May it be so. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Derek. And already I get a sense of the fertility of this dialogue, and that's wonderful. So thank you very, very much. And our last, but by no means least, we turn to Jason.
Well, thank you so much, Craig. I really appreciate the opportunity to join this distinguished group as well as this panel. And I'm really thankful for the Kirby Lang Center for hosting this event today. As I will echo much of what Dr. Schuurman has said, I look up to him not only in the faith, but also in these areas, especially given his practitioner experience as a technologist. And so just to lay all of the cards on the table, I come to a lot of these debates and a lot of these issues from an ethical and theological perspective. As one trained in these issues, I echo a lot of what Dr. Schuurman said about the need for more technologists to be involved, not only in these conversations, as they are the ones who are developing and making these technologies, but also in writing in a lot of these conversations. So that's something that I definitely came away from with the volume, is the need for more helpful Christian thought on these issues. This book to me was a helpful addition to the growing literature on artificial intelligence and how Christians might think through some of the ethical, theological, and philosophical dimensions of this powerful and really life-altering technology. I think often when I speak of AI, or and probably some of the receptions to a book like this, is that a lot of folks believe that artificial intelligence is something far off and distant, not understanding that we're utilizing these tools every single day. Every aspect of our life in some sense is smart or controlled by some type of algorithm or artificial intelligence system. And so the need for this type of authentic Christian response and engagement is a tall order, and something that I'm very much glad that this book was produced. Given the volume, or given the breadth of this volume, there's so much that we could focus on and that we should focus on as Christians. And typically when I respond to a volume or even review a volume, I try not to critique what's not in the volume. I want to engage with what is there. And so while there are obviously chapters that could be added or kind of supplemented, etc., some of the focus that I want to do in my short time is focus on one of the most important aspects, I think, of the volume, and one of the most important issues that our society is facing today that's often overlooked, especially by kind of a growing secular culture, or they're just simply assumed given the advances in science and technology today. And this is this fundamental kind of most important question to me is very much what is tackled early on in the book, especially in part 2, which is, what does it mean to be human? We have to ask ourselves, in light of these advanced machines and how we've traditionally understood the image of God and what it means to be human. And this is something Dr. Wyatt mentioned as well early on in the intro here, is that there's often, especially within the Christian church, a specific understanding of the image of God. This is the exact question that we sought at the ERLC to answer and to be in dialogue with when we released the first faith-based statement on artificial intelligence, called Artificial Intelligence, an Evangelical Statement of Principles, a few years ago. And it's really been a central aspect of my work in Christian theology, philosophy, and ethics. And as I teach my students, this question of what it means to be human is not only foundational to our understanding of what it means to be human, how we interact in this world and our relationship with God and others, but also to our approach of technology. And specifically to our approach of technology in terms of theology and ethics in general, because understanding who we are and our role in this universe, we can begin to reframe a lot of the pressing questions of the day in light of this Christian truth and Christian worldview. Many, if not all, of the pressing theological, ethical, and philosophical questions of the day, especially with the advanced rise of artificial intelligence, to me are actually not new questions at all. These questions, I believe technology doesn't actually cause us to ask new questions per se, but to ask fundamental questions in light of new opportunities. In many ways, technology, as we've seen, is not really just simply a tool that we use for good or ill, but it's a tool that radically alters and shapes not only how we see the world around us, but also it shapes us as individuals and as human beings. And in many ways, it disciples us towards a very particular end and goal in mind. And while we don't have the time, nor even in the volume, to expound on a Christian philosophy of technology in our short time together, a proper understanding of technology focuses on how these tools expand our moral horizons and shape us as image bearers. And I think that's one of the keys to navigating a lot of the challenges before us today. One of the reasons that I was so encouraged to see the inclusion of Dr. Nori Hertzfeld, someone that I've looked up to in these areas, specifically focusing on a lot of the challenges of theological anthropology in light of advanced technology. I've long admired her work as she connects these kind of two areas of theological anthropology and artificial intelligence. and shapes how a Christian, as someone who's trained in both disciplines, how the Christian reflection shapes our understanding of ourselves, as well as shapes the understanding of artificial intelligence. Both of the editors in their contributions rightly highlight this connection, as much of the Christian church has seen the uniqueness of human beings based on a substantive aspect of the image, seeing something often in our cast in terms of our rational capacities, the distinguishing factor of humanity from the rest of creation. As noted in the volume, there's widespread disagreement amongst believers on what actually constitutes the image of God, and even some questioning the centrality of the image of God to Christian theology, ethics, and philosophy, due to the seemingly neglected nature of this doctrine, or development of this doctrine in the scriptures themselves outside of a few key texts and areas. But while there are some substantive aspects or differences on the image of on the Imago Dei, I think this doctrine is central to theological disciplines and ethical disciplines, in line with a lot of the Protestant titans, such as one of my heroes in the faith, Herman Bavinck, as well as Carl F.H. Henry. Because a proper understanding of theological anthropology, or what it means to be human, is a key aspect to understanding in many ways who God is, who we are as human beings, and what's the nature of reality, knowledge, and even the pursuit of morality and ethics. I believe outside of the Trinity, as a central understanding of God as he's revealed himself, the Imago Dei is a crucial aspect of the Christian worldview and to the nature of the church, especially in the digital age, when the conception of what it means to be human is often challenged and seen as at odds with what the scripture reveals to us. To me, Dr. Hertzfeld's contribution wisely highlighted the three prevailing views of the image of God as the substantive view, the relational view, as well as the functional view. And in this contribution, as well as her other writings, she tends to highlight the relational aspects as opposed to a lot of the substantive aspects of the image of God. Not only is God himself in an eternal relationship with the other members of the Trinity from all eternity, but he's also created humanity to be in relationship with himself and to be in relationship with one another. This is highlighted in the fact of Jesus' own words, where he's summing up the nature of the law and the prophets when he says, the greatest commandment is to love the Lord your God with all your heart, mind, soul, and strength, and to love your neighbor as yourself, as he says in Matthew 22, verses 37 through 39. This is the summation not only of the law and the prophets, but as many ethicists argue, is also the summation of the Christian ethic. So not to belabor the point, but Williams and Wyatt rightly point out that that the aspect of the image of God as the intellect or the rational capacities is often overemphasized throughout the history of the church, as well as this, in many ways, contemporary fixation on the idea of human autonomy, which is really interesting, especially as Christians approach ideas of human autonomy or autonomy in general, because we live a life in complete and total dependence upon God as individuals in a community of fellow believers. Here, Dr. Hertzfeld rightly points out and highlights the relational aspects, but also what I think is employing a moral and theological complicated language at times, where she highlights the idea of human beings as co-creators. That's something that's very, very popular in a lot of Christian circles, but I think can be a dangerous way to approach this, because in many ways, the language of co-creators can equate or connote the idea that we are some sense peers with God, that we create like God, or that we are right alongside God in terms of our value. And especially in a culture that sees self-autonomy or ourselves in many ways as gods, I think that can be dangerous language to be used in this. And she draws throughout her chapter upon Karl Barth's understanding of our relationship with God, as she highlights a partnership aspect from his infamous church dogmatics. This language to me indicates that type of peer relationship with God rather than one of total dependence and subjugation to his lordship. Overall, while I don't see that there are many tensions within the three prevailing views of the image of God, I tend to highlight the functional aspect, which is one that wasn't dwelled on as much within the volume, because I think that this is something that can help us to understand the fullness of what it means to be created in God's image. The functional aspect doesn't preclude these other views, nor does it is seen as separate from these other aspects. And Hertzfeld rightfully points out here and in other works that the dangers of a purely substantive view, especially with those people with disabilities, or even the dangers of how a functional view of dominion without a relationship with God and one another and the rest of creation, how that plays out in reality. This, to me, the functional view is often highlighted as the vice regency view, given that God's command to Adam and Eve in Genesis 1:28 through 31 is for them to represent God in caring for and stewarding all of creation under the lordship and kingship of God. This means that dominion is not separated from moral accountability or relational community with God and with one another. This is a call to care for and to steward, not to wield unaccountable power or strength as God's image bearers. And this view also doesn't preclude the complementary aspects of the man and the woman as both fully made in the image of God with equal worth, dignity, and responsibilities, even if they have different functions within God's economy of his creation. While other parts of creation may have certain strengths or greater strengths or even abilities. I'm thinking namely certain animals have higher strength capacities than human beings, or even angels themselves, which is kind of a neglected area, especially in a lot of the theological aspects of advanced artificial intelligence, is what do we do with angels and the nature of angelology, where they have greater, in many ways, rational capacities than human beings do. I think that the idea of the functional aspect of the image of God highlights the fact that we tend to gravitate towards the image of God, and that we must not fail to understand that Christ himself is the true image of God. And this was referenced a couple times in the volume, especially in Hertzfeld, as well as Robert Song's very helpful chapter. This Christological view of the image of God has been promoted in recent years by many scholars, and I believe is a pretty intriguing way to think about the fullness of the image in light of the centrality of Christ, because we are made in the image of the second Adam. We're made and we function as mirrors reflecting his glory throughout all of creation. Given much of the rampant and often nihilistic naturalism of our day, especially in the sciences and technology, I think the church can tell a better story. The better story focused on the centrality of the image of God, which is something that I very much appreciate throughout the whole volume, but something that I wish the volume would be able to go into a little bit deeper. Because the church can tell this better story focused on the centrality of the image of God in theology, ethics, and philosophy, as well as our public engagement on pressing social and even political issues of the day, regardless of how these powerful and life-altering technologies like artificial intelligence shape us and form us. As I've long said, and was particularly pleased to see Robert Song highlight in this volume, is that we must focus our attention on human dignity in the age of machines, because we tend to humanize our machines at the same time that we're dehumanizing ourselves. And so because we have a faulty understanding of what it means to be human, we often portray these human-like capacities on these machines, part of God's good creation to be used for his glory and love of neighbor. But in this ironic twist, we dehumanize ourselves, seeing ourselves as nothing but machines. We question if machines will gain human level intelligence or even greater with superhuman intelligence. But at the same time, we're devaluing and demystifying the very ones created in the image of God, from the baby in the womb to the elderly woman on her deathbed. We'll question their value, their usefulness in society. At the same time, we proclaim that these tools will become like humans, or we give them names or even faces. And so a lot of the book itself, for me, that was really interesting was especially part 2, and then how part 2 plays its way out into part 3, getting into a lot of the issues, a lot of the questions that people have. So I just really appreciated the book. I'm really grateful for Dr. Wyatt and for Dr. Williams focusing and bringing together this range of scholars, especially Dr. Hertzfeld and Dr. Song, as we focus on the real critical questions of what does it mean to be human in the age of machines.